The room was filled with people who believed intelligence always dressed in expensive suits. That belief was about to be quietly dismantled by a 10-year-old girl standing near the wall. The Grand Meridian Ballroom in downtown Chicago shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers that looked large enough to hang over a Broadway stage. The air carried the faint scent of polished oak floors, citrus cleaning spray, and the kind of perfume that usually appeared only at events where billion-dollar decisions were made over quiet conversations and carefully measured smiles. A long row of glass windows overlooked the evening skyline, where the last orange light of sunset reflected off steel towers and slow-moving traffic nearly 200 feet below. Inside the ballroom, men in tailored suits and women in elegant evening dresses gathered around tall tables covered with white linen and silver trays of sparkling water and small desserts that looked more like art than food. The event was the Hawthorne International Investment Summit, a gathering where CEOs, venture capitalists, and policy advisors discussed projects that could reshape entire industries. At the center of that world stood Richard Hawthorne, a billionaire known as much for his sharp mind as for the confidence that followed him everywhere he went. At 62 years old, Richard carried himself with the relaxed certainty of a man who had spent 4 decades watching his decisions turn into skyscrapers and companies. His silver hair was neatly combed, his navy suit fit perfectly across his shoulders, and when he spoke people leaned in slightly, because they expected something important to follow. Across the room, near a quiet service station where pitchers of water and folded napkins waited for the next round of guests, Emily Carter moved carefully between tables collecting empty glasses. She wore the standard uniform required by the hotel staff, a black skirt, a pressed white shirt, and comfortable shoes designed for 12-hour shifts. Emily worked 2 jobs to keep her small apartment on the north side of the city, and tonight's event meant a little extra money that would help cover groceries and school supplies. Standing beside the wall a few feet away from her was her daughter Lily Carter, a small girl with light brown hair tied back in a simple ponytail and a faded blue sweater that had clearly been washed many times. Lily had been forced to come with her mother that evening because the after-school program closed early and the neighbor who sometimes watched her had left town for the weekend. Emily had whispered the same instructions she always gave when Lily accompanied her to work. Stay quiet. Stay close to the wall. Pretend you are invisible. Lily tried to follow those instructions carefully. She held a worn paperback book close to her chest and watched the room with calm curiosity while the quiet hum of conversation rose and fell like distant traffic. Most of the guests barely noticed the child near the wall, but Lily noticed everything. She noticed the way the investors leaned forward when Richard Hawthorne spoke. She noticed the way the city lights slowly brightened outside the windows. And she noticed something else that no one in the room expected. A moment that had not happened yet, but was already moving closer with every passing second. A moment when one sentence spoken in a foreign language would change the entire atmosphere of that ballroom and reveal something the powerful man in the center of the room never imagined could come from the quiet corner where a waitress daughter was supposed to remain invisible. The ballroom continued to glow with quiet prestige as the evening program moved forward, the kind of environment where every word carried weight and every handshake could represent millions of dollars. Soft instrumental music drifted through hidden speakers while waiters moved with careful precision between clusters of investors discussing technology, energy, and international trade. Richard Hawthorne stood near a large digital display that projected maps and financial charts across a 10-foot screen, explaining a new European logistics partnership that his company intended to finalize before the end of the quarter. The investors surrounding him listened closely because Hawthorne had earned a reputation for turning complicated ideas into profitable realities. His voice was calm and deliberate, the voice of a man used to speaking in boardrooms where a single sentence could shift markets. While the room focused on him, Emily Carter quietly cleared empty glasses from a nearby table and replaced them with fresh water for the next group of guests. She worked efficiently, her movements practiced, and almost invisible, the way experienced service staff learned to operate in rooms where powerful people preferred not to notice the workers around them. Lily remained near the wall exactly where her mother had asked her to stay. She opened the worn paperback she carried and began reading again, her eyes moving steadily across the pages while the soft glow from the ballroom lights reflected off the polished floor beneath her shoes. The book was printed in German, its pages slightly curled from years of use. To most people passing by, it looked like nothing more than a child holding a book she probably did not understand, but Lily followed each line with quiet concentration, occasionally whispering a word to herself as if testing the sound of it. Across the room, Richard Hawthorne continued answering questions from several international investors who had flown in from New York, Texas, and California to attend the summit. One of them asked about language barriers and overseas contracts, mentioning that translation errors had once delayed a major shipment in Hamburg. Hawthorne smiled slightly at the comment and responded with a light laugh that carried easily through the surrounding conversation. He explained that he personally reviewed many European documents himself because he spoke German fluently after studying in Munich during his early career. The investors nodded with polite admiration because language skills were often treated like an intellectual trophy in rooms like this. Hawthorne seemed to enjoy the attention. As the discussion continued, his gaze briefly moved across the ballroom and landed on the quiet corner where Lily stood reading her book. For a moment, he studied the scene with mild curiosity. A small girl, a service worker's daughter, holding a German text in a room filled with executives. The contrast amused him. Hawthorne stepped away from the group of investors and walked several feet closer, his polished shoes tapping softly against the floor. Several guests followed his movement out of curiosity, assuming he intended to make a humorous observation to lighten the conversation. Emily noticed the shift immediately and felt a small knot of concern tighten in her chest. She recognized the look of casual amusement on Hawthorne's face, the same expression powerful people sometimes wore when they prepared to make a comment that turned someone else into the subject of entertainment. Lily did not notice him at first because she was finishing a paragraph near the middle of the page, carefully sounding out a long compound word that stretched across the line. When she finally looked up, she found Richard Hawthorne standing only a few feet away, smiling slightly as several investors gathered behind him waiting to hear what he would say next. The quiet corner of the ballroom suddenly felt less invisible. Richard Hawthorne allowed the silence to linger for a moment as he studied the small book in Lily Carter's hands, the faint smile on his face growing just enough for the nearby investors to sense that a remark was coming. People who spent time around powerful executives learned to recognize that moment, the moment when attention shifted and a room subtly prepared itself for a display of wit or authority. The investors behind him watched with mild curiosity while several guests nearby turned their heads slightly toward the quiet corner. Emily Carter felt the tension immediately, even though she continued holding a tray of glasses against her side, as if nothing unusual was happening. She knew the atmosphere of rooms like this one. She had seen it many times while working long shifts in restaurants and event halls across Chicago. Sometimes a wealthy guest made a friendly comment. Sometimes the attention was harmless. But sometimes the tone carried a quiet edge that turned an ordinary moment into something uncomfortable. Lily stood still near the wall, her paperback book resting lightly in both hands. The pages were slightly worn and the cover had softened from years of use. But the title printed across the front was clear to anyone who knew the language. It was a collection of German short stories, printed decades earlier in a style of formal writing that many students found difficult even in university classrooms. Richard Hawthorne tilted his head slightly as he read the title, and then glanced back toward the group of investors who had followed him across the floor. A faint chuckle escaped from him, the kind of quiet laugh that suggested he had discovered something mildly entertaining. One of the investors asked what he had noticed, and Hawthorne gestured lightly toward Lily's book with the relaxed confidence of someone used to speaking for an audience. The movement caused several people nearby to lean closer, curious about the exchange that was unfolding in the corner of the ballroom. Lily looked up at him calmly, her expression curious rather than nervous, as if she were simply trying to understand why a stranger had suddenly appeared beside her. Richard Hawthorne crossed his arms loosely and spoke with the smooth voice that had guided countless negotiations and public presentations throughout his career. But this time he did not speak in English. Instead, he addressed her in German, the words flowing easily from him with the confident rhythm of someone who had practiced the language for years. His tone carried a light, teasing note as he made a remark about the difficulty of the text she was holding, suggesting that even many adults struggled to understand writing like that. A few investors behind him smiled politely because they assumed the girl would not understand the comment. One of them even laughed softly, interpreting the moment as a harmless bit of humor in an otherwise serious evening. Emily Carter felt her shoulders tighten slightly when she heard the language change. She did not speak German herself, but she recognized the cadence of it from movies and documentaries, and she understood enough about social situations to realize what Hawthorne was doing. He believed he was making a clever observation that the child could not follow. Lily listened carefully as he finished speaking, her eyes steady and thoughtful. For a brief moment she said nothing. The ballroom lights reflected softly across the polished floor, while several investors waited for the quiet moment to pass. Richard Hawthorne seemed satisfied with the reaction he had created and glanced briefly back toward the group as if expecting the conversation to move on. But Lily Carter did not lower her book. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly, and when she finally spoke, the language that came from her was the same one Hawthorne had just used, pronounced clearly and calmly with the careful precision of someone who had spent years listening to its rhythms. The quiet corner of the ballroom grew suddenly still. The silence that followed Lily Carter's explanation did not disappear immediately. It lingered in the air beneath the crystal chandeliers, spreading through the small circle of investors who had gathered near the corner of the ballroom. Richard Hawthorne studied the child with a focus that had replaced his earlier amusement. His eyes moved briefly from the book in her hands back to her calm expression, as though he were recalculating the situation in front of him. For decades, he had built a reputation for reading people quickly, for recognizing intelligence in boardrooms filled with executives and negotiators. Yet the scene unfolding now did not match any pattern he expected to see at an international investment summit. One of the investors beside him cleared his throat quietly and asked again what the girl had said. Hawthorne exhaled slowly before answering. He translated Lily's words into English, repeating the correction she had offered about the phrasing and context of the passage. The explanation sounded even more precise when spoken aloud. Several people glanced at one another, their curiosity growing as they realized the child had not simply repeated memorized words. She had understood the meaning behind the language. Lily listened politely while Hawthorne translated, then lifted her eyes again when he finished speaking. The calm steadiness in her expression did not change. She seemed completely comfortable standing there despite the attention of powerful strangers who were now watching her with open interest. Hawthorne shifted his weight slightly, still holding the quiet authority that had defined his presence throughout the evening, but something in his posture had changed. The casual confidence he had carried across the ballroom had been replaced by a more deliberate curiosity. He asked her another question in German, this time more carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone testing a possibility. Lily answered again, without hesitation. Her response came with the same smooth rhythm as before, explaining the difference between two grammatical forms used in the sentence he had quoted earlier. One of the investors behind Hawthorne leaned forward with visible fascination, whispering to a colleague that the girl sounded like someone who had studied the language for years. Emily Carter remained still beside the service table, feeling a mixture of pride and nervousness as she listened. She had always known Lily possessed an unusual patience for learning languages. The girl spent evenings practicing with old recordings that once belonged to her grandfather, repeating phrases slowly while scribbling notes in the margins of worn notebooks. But hearing her speak so comfortably in front of a room full of executives felt almost surreal. Hawthorne asked another question, this time switching briefly to English as if to confirm what he was beginning to suspect. He wanted to know where she had learned to speak German so well. Lily glanced toward her mother for a moment before answering politely that she had learned from books and from the recordings her grandfather had left behind. The investors exchanged another round of quiet glances. In a ballroom filled with individuals who prided themselves on education and international experience, the realization settled slowly that the quiet girl standing near the wall possessed something none of them had expected to encounter that evening. And for the first time since he had approached the corner, Richard Hawthorne felt the subtle shift of control in the conversation he had started. The quiet circle of investors around Richard Hawthorne grew slightly larger as more guests noticed the unusual conversation unfolding near the wall. The soft music that floated through the ballroom continued to play, but the attention of several people nearby had shifted completely to the calm exchange between the billionaire and the small girl holding a worn paperback book. Hawthorne remained standing in front of Lily Carter, studying her with a thoughtful expression that had replaced the earlier trace of amusement. For a man who had spent 40 years negotiating international deals and interviewing some of the most accomplished professionals in finance and technology, he had developed an instinct for recognizing genuine knowledge when he heard it. The answers Lily had given so far did not sound like memorized phrases. They carried the quiet structure of someone who truly understood the language she was speaking. Hawthorne asked another question in German, this one slightly more complex. He referred to a passage from the kind of legal translation that often appeared in European contracts, and asked her how the meaning might change if a particular word were interpreted in its older literary form rather than its modern conversational use. The investors nearby leaned closer as Lily listened. She paused only for a moment, glancing down at the page of her book as if considering the structure of the sentence in her mind. Then she answered carefully in German again, explaining that the difference could alter the implied responsibility in a formal agreement. Her voice remained steady, the explanation simple but precise. When Hawthorne translated her words back into English for the others, the reaction was immediate. A few of the investors raised their eyebrows in visible surprise. One man quietly remarked that the girl sounded like a university student specializing in European linguistics rather than a child standing beside a service station in a hotel ballroom. Emily Carter watched the exchange with growing amazement. She had always encouraged Lily to read and study languages because the girl seemed naturally drawn to them, but she had never imagined that skill would suddenly become the center of attention in a room filled with influential business leaders. Hawthorne took another slow breath and folded his hands loosely in front of him. The conversation had clearly shifted away from the playful moment he had expected when he first approached the corner. Now it had become something closer to an intellectual puzzle. He asked Lily a final question, again in German, this time quoting a short line from a contract phrase used in international logistics agreements. The line was subtle, the kind of wording that lawyers often debated because a small difference in interpretation could change the meaning of an entire clause. Lily listened carefully and then responded with a thoughtful explanation. She said that the phrasing he used could be misleading because the original German structure implied a conditional responsibility rather than an absolute one. She added politely that if someone translated the sentence too literally into English, it might create confusion about which party carried the obligation in the agreement. The investors behind Hawthorne exchanged another round of quiet looks. Several of them had spent years reviewing international contracts themselves, and they recognized the accuracy of what the child had just described. Hawthorne remained silent for a moment after translating her explanation, his eyes resting on the book still held lightly in her hands. The room had grown noticeably quieter around them, and for the first time that evening the billionaire understood that the conversation he had started in casual confidence had turned into something far more revealing than he had intended. The quiet tension in the corner of the ballroom deepened as Richard Hawthorne stood motionless for a few seconds longer than anyone expected. Around him, the investors who had gathered to watch the exchange were no longer smiling with casual amusement. Instead, they studied the small girl beside the wall with a mixture of curiosity and genuine respect. Hawthorne finally lifted his eyes from the book in Lily Carter's hands and looked directly at her again, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. The polished confidence that had defined his presence throughout the evening had softened into something more careful, the expression of a man reconsidering an assumption he had made only minutes earlier. He spoke again, this time in English so that everyone around him could follow the conversation. He asked Lily whether she understood how important the kind of wording she had just explained could be in international contracts. Lily nodded slightly and answered in the same calm voice she had used since the conversation began. She explained that her grandfather had once told her that languages were like puzzles, and that the meaning of a sentence often depended on the smallest piece fitting exactly where it belonged. Several of the investors listened with quiet fascination as she described how certain German legal phrases could be misunderstood when translated too quickly into English. One man who specialized in European trade agreements whispered to a colleague that the girl was describing a problem that had once delayed a shipment worth nearly $20 million. Richard Hawthorne folded his hands loosely in front of him and allowed a slow breath to pass as he absorbed the moment. For the first time that evening, he glanced around the small circle of investors, recognizing the same realization forming in their expressions. The child he had approached as a casual joke had just demonstrated a level of linguistic awareness that many experienced professionals struggled to reach. Emily Carter watched from the edge of the group, still holding her tray of glasses as if she had forgotten it was there. Pride warmed her chest, but she also felt the nervous awareness that every eye in the room seemed to be focused on her daughter. Lily remained calm, holding her book lightly against her sweater, unaware that the quiet explanation she had given moments earlier had changed the atmosphere of the entire conversation. Hawthorne turned back toward her and asked one final question, his tone now respectful rather than teasing. He asked whether she enjoyed studying languages or whether German was simply a subject she happened to read about occasionally. Lily answered honestly that she loved learning how different languages shaped the way people thought. She explained that every language carried its own logic, and once someone understood that logic, the words began to feel less like foreign sounds and more like a new way of seeing the world. The investors exchanged another series of glances, and a few of them nodded slowly as though acknowledging an insight they had not expected to hear from a 10-year-old child standing quietly beside a service station in a hotel ballroom. Richard Hawthorne allowed a faint smile to return to his face, but it was no longer the amused smile of a man making a joke. It was the expression of someone who had just recognized that the smallest voice in the room had quietly changed the entire conversation. The atmosphere around the small gathering in the corner of the ballroom had shifted so noticeably that even guests across the room began to sense that something unusual was happening. Conversations that had once revolved around market forecasts and investment strategies slowed as curious glances drifted toward the group surrounding Richard Hawthorne and the young girl beside the wall. The soft music continued to float through the elegant hall, but the attention of many investors had quietly moved away from the stage and toward the calm exchange that had unfolded without anyone expecting it. Richard Hawthorne stood with his hands loosely clasped in front of him, his posture no longer that of a man entertaining a casual moment. Instead, he looked thoughtful, almost reflective, as he regarded Lily Carter. The book she held remained gently pressed against her sweater, its worn cover a quiet reminder that knowledge sometimes came from places that expensive rooms rarely noticed. Hawthorne slowly nodded as if acknowledging a conclusion he had reached internally. He spoke again in English so that the growing audience nearby could hear him clearly. He said that language had always fascinated him because it shaped the structure of negotiations and agreements across borders. Yet he admitted with a small, honest smile that it had been many years since someone had corrected him so carefully in the middle of a conversation. The investors around him chuckled softly, not in mockery, but in appreciation of the humility in his tone. Lily looked slightly puzzled by the attention, but remained polite and composed, answering that she had only wanted to explain the sentence correctly because her grandfather had always said that understanding the meaning of words was a form of respect for the people who used them. The comment caused another ripple of quiet admiration among the investors. One woman who worked in international finance leaned toward a colleague and whispered that the girl had just summarized the core principle of translation better than most professionals she had met. Emily Carter felt the tension she had carried in her shoulders slowly ease. She realized that the room was no longer focused on judging her daughter, but rather listening to her. Hawthorne glanced briefly toward Emily and gave her a small nod that carried both recognition and respect. Then he turned his attention back to Lily and asked if she planned to continue studying languages as she grew older. Lily answered that she hoped to learn several more, because each new language felt like discovering another way to understand people. Hawthorne smiled again, this time with genuine warmth. He looked around the circle of investors and said that moments like this were a reminder that intelligence rarely announces itself in advance. Sometimes it simply appears quietly in the corner of a room when no one expects it. The guests nearby nodded thoughtfully, the earlier amusement of the evening now replaced by a deeper appreciation for what they had just witnessed. In a ballroom built to celebrate wealth and influence, a small conversation had just revealed that insight and curiosity could arrive from the most unexpected place. The quiet attention that had gathered around the corner of the ballroom did not fade immediately after Richard Hawthorne finished speaking. Instead, the moment settled into the room like a soft realization shared by everyone who had witnessed the exchange. The chandeliers above continued to cast warm reflections across the polished floor, while the skyline outside the tall windows glowed with the steady lights of the evening city. The Hawthorne International Investment Summit slowly resumed its usual rhythm of conversation and negotiation. Yet something subtle had changed among the group of investors who had stood nearby. They had come expecting to discuss markets and numbers, but they had just watched a quiet reminder that knowledge did not always follow the paths people expected. Richard Hawthorne remained standing for a moment longer beside Lily Carter, studying the worn book she still held with both hands. The faint smile on his face now carried a tone of genuine respect rather than amusement. He thanked her calmly for the explanation she had given earlier, and said that her careful attention to language had demonstrated something important that many professionals sometimes forgot. Words were not only tools for communication. They were bridges between people, and those bridges needed to be built with patience and understanding. Lily listened politely, slightly shy now that the attention of so many adults had focused on her. She simply nodded and said that her grandfather had always believed that learning languages helped people see the world from another person's perspective. Hawthorne nodded thoughtfully when he heard that answer. For a man whose career had been shaped by international deals and negotiations across continents, the idea carried a deeper meaning than it might have earlier in the evening. He turned briefly toward Emily Carter and thanked her as well, recognizing the quiet effort required to raise a child who valued learning so deeply. Emily felt a mixture of relief and gratitude as she returned the polite acknowledgement, still holding the tray she had forgotten about earlier in the conversation. Around them, the investors slowly returned to their discussions, but several of them glanced once more toward Lily with quiet admiration before moving away. Hawthorne eventually stepped back toward the center of the ballroom where the evening program was continuing. Yet before leaving, he paused for a moment and looked once more toward the quiet corner where the unexpected conversation had begun. The room still held the same chandeliers, the same polished floors, and the same gathering of powerful guests it had held earlier that evening. But for those who had watched closely, the moment had revealed something lasting. Intelligence did not belong exclusively to titles, wealth, or position. Sometimes it appeared quietly beside a wall where no one thought to look. And when it did, it carried a gentle reminder that curiosity and respect for knowledge could come from anyone willing to listen, learn, and speak with clarity when the moment arrived.